The concrete dust hadn't even settled when the sirens pierced the morning air. Sarah Chen watched in disbelief as 3 squad cars screeched to a halt outside her home, followed by a furious blonde woman pointing directly at the massive hole where her pool used to be. "Arrest her!" Karen Whitmore shrieked, her manicured finger trembling with rage. "She's destroyed our property values. She's ruined everything." But as the officers stepped out, Sarah clutched the crumpled legal document in her pocket. The one that would expose Karen's darkest secret and turn this neighborhood war into something far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The jackhammer's violent percussion shattered the pre-dawn stillness of Maple Grove Circle, each blow sending tremors through the perfectly manicured suburban landscape. Sarah Chen wiped sweat from her brow despite the morning chill, watching as the demolition crew methodically dismantled what had once been her pride and joy, a pristine 40-foot swimming pool that had cost her and David nearly $60,000 just 3 years ago. "You sure about this, Mrs. Chen?" called out Miguel, the crew foreman, his voice barely audible over the industrial chaos. "This is a hell of a nice pool. Shame to see it go." Sarah nodded grimly, her dark eyes fixed on the destruction. "I'm sure. Every last tile." The pool had become her prison. After David's sudden death from a heart attack last spring, the sight of those crystal blue waters had transformed from a source of joy into a daily reminder of everything she'd lost. Their Saturday morning laps together, the summer barbecues where David would cannonball in fully clothed just to make their daughter Emma laugh, the quiet evenings floating side by side, planning their future. Now Emma was away at Northwestern, and the pool stood empty and accusing, a $15,000 annual maintenance burden that Sarah could no longer afford on her teacher's salary. The life insurance had covered David's medical bills and funeral costs, but little else. The choice was simple: lose the pool or lose the house. As the crew worked, Sarah caught glimpses of her neighbors peering through windows and from behind, privacy fences. The Hendersons next door had already made their disapproval known with increasingly cold greetings. Mrs. Patterson from across the street had actually crossed to the other sidewalk rather than walk past Sarah's house yesterday morning. But it was the house directly behind hers that worried her most. Karen Whitmore's Tudor-style mansion loomed over the back fence like a disapproving patriarch, its perfectly manicured grounds and infinity pool creating a stark contrast to the chaos currently consuming Sarah's backyard. Karen had moved to Maple Grove Circle 5 years ago with her investment banker husband Richard, immediately establishing herself as the neighborhood's self-appointed guardian of property values and social standards. The first sign of trouble had come 2 weeks ago, when Sarah had posted the required demolition notice on her property. Within hours, Karen had marched over with a clipboard and a smile that never reached her ice-blue eyes. "Sarah, darling," Karen had said, her voice dripping with false concern, "I think there's been some sort of mistake with this notice. You can't possibly be serious about removing that gorgeous pool." "It's not a mistake, Karen. The demolition starts Monday." Karen's smile had faltered for just a moment before snapping back into place. "Well, I'm afraid I can't allow that. See, Richard and I have been working with a realtor to assess our home's value, and she specifically mentioned how the neighborhood's pool density affects property values. Your pool contributes approximately $40,000 to our home's worth." Sarah had stared at her incredulous. "My pool contributes to your property value?" "Of course. The aesthetic appeal, the sense of luxury living. These things matter, Sarah. I'm sure you understand. Perhaps we could work out some sort of arrangement. Richard and I would be happy to help with the maintenance costs in exchange for—" "No." Sarah's voice had been firm. "The pool goes Monday." Karen's mask had slipped completely then, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "I wouldn't be so hasty if I were you. There are zoning laws, environmental regulations, permit requirements. The HOA has very specific rules about major property modifications. You might find this more complicated than you anticipated. Now, as the demolition crew worked with surgical precision, Sarah wondered if Karen had been bluffing. The permits had gone through without issue. The environmental impact assessment had been approved. Even the HOA, of which Karen served as vice president, had grudgingly signed off on the removal. "Mrs. Chen," Miguel's voice cut through her thoughts. "We've got a problem." Sarah hurried over to where the crew had stopped working. Miguel pointed to a section of exposed piping near the pool's deep end. "This line here, it's not on any of the city plans. Looks like a drainage pipe, but it's running toward your neighbor's property. We can't proceed without knowing what it is and where it goes." Sarah knelt down to examine the mysterious pipe. It was newer than the pool's original plumbing, made of PVC rather than the copper lines that serviced the filtration system. "I've never seen this before. David never mentioned any additional drainage." "Could be a gray water system," suggested Tom, one of the crew members. "Some folks run pool water to irrigate landscaping. But this one looks like it was installed after the fact." A cold knot of unease formed in Sarah's stomach. The pipe was angled directly toward Karen's property, disappearing under the shared fence line. "Can you trace where it goes?" Miguel shook his head. "Not without excavating your neighbor's yard. We'd need their permission for that." As if summoned by their conversation, the back gate of Karen's property swung open with theatrical precision. Karen Whitmore emerged like a queen surveying her domain, her platinum blonde hair perfectly coiffed despite the early hour, wearing yoga attire that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly grocery budget. "Sarah!" Karen's voice rang out with false cheerfulness as she approached the fence. "My goodness, what a terrible racket you're making. Richard had to take his conference call from the car." "The demolition notice specified the work hours, Karen. We're well within the permitted time frame." Karen's gaze shifted to the excavation site, and Sarah caught a flicker of something, concern, fear, cross her perfectly made-up features, before the practiced smile returned. Of course. I just wanted to pop over and see how things were progressing. I have to say, seeing it actually happening is quite jarring. Such a beautiful pool." Her eyes lingered on the exposed pipe. "Is everything proceeding smoothly? No unexpected complications?" Miguel stepped forward. "Actually, ma'am, we've found an undocumented drainage line that appears to run toward your property. You wouldn't happen to know anything about it, would you?" The change in Karen was immediate and startling. Her face went pale beneath her foundation, and her hands clenched into fists at her sides. No, I wouldn't know anything about that. Why would I?" Sarah studied Karen's reaction carefully. In her 15 years of teaching high school, she'd developed a finely tuned radar for when students were lying. Every instinct was screaming that Karen was hiding something. "It's probably nothing," Sarah said carefully, watching Karen's face. "Just some gray water drainage David installed without telling me. We'll cap it off and move on." "Yes," Karen said quickly, too quickly. "Yes, that's probably exactly what it is. Gray water. Very environmentally conscious of David. You should definitely cap it immediately." Miguel looked between the two women, clearly sensing the tension. "Well, we'll need to inspect it. First, make sure it's not connected to the municipal water system. City regulations require—" "No!" Karen's voice cracked like a whip. "I mean, surely that's not necessary for a simple gray water line. The city must have more important things to worry about." Sarah felt the pieces of a puzzle beginning to take shape in her mind, though she couldn't yet see the full picture. "Karen, is there something you need to tell me about this pipe?" For a moment, Karen's composure cracked completely. Her face cycled through a series of expressions: panic, calculation, and finally, cold determination. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Sarah, I strongly advise you to finish this demolition quickly and quietly. Cap that pipe and fill in the hole. Don't ask questions about things that don't concern you. The threat was unmistakable, but Sarah had faced down angry parents, hostile administrators, and teenage bullies throughout her career. She wasn't about to be intimidated by a suburban soccer mom with delusions of grandeur. Actually, Karen, I think I'm more curious than ever about where this pipe goes. Miguel, let's trace that line properly. I want to know exactly what David was doing and why. Karen's face went white with rage. You're making a mistake, Sarah, a very serious mistake. There are things about this neighborhood, about your late husband, that you're better off not knowing. Before Sarah could respond, Karen spun on her designer heel and stalked back toward her house, but not before Sarah caught her pulling out her phone and dialing with trembling fingers. Miguel watched Karen's retreat with raised eyebrows. Lady's got some serious issues. You want us to keep digging? Sarah stared at the mysterious pipe, David's face floating in her memory. Her gentle, honest husband who'd never hidden anything from her in 22 years. Sarah's hands trembled as she closed her kitchen door behind her, the chaos outside muffled but still audible through the windows. Police radios crackled. Neighbors argued in raised voices, and somewhere in the distance she could hear Karen's shrill protests as the officers questioned her about the chemical distribution system. The envelope felt impossibly heavy in Sarah's pocket. She'd found it that morning while packing away David's personal effects from his home office, tucked between the pages of his college chemistry textbook, a book she'd never seen him open in all their years of marriage. Emergency only, for Sarah, was written across the front in David's careful handwriting, but underneath, in smaller letters that she'd missed earlier, were the words, "If something happens to me." Sarah sank into the kitchen chair where David used to drink his morning coffee, where they'd planned their days together, where he'd helped Emma with her homework through high school. The normalcy of the setting made the horror outside seem even more surreal. With shaking fingers, she tore open the envelope. Inside were 3 items: a handwritten letter, a small brass key, and a USB drive labeled insurance. Sarah unfolded. The letter and David's familiar script seemed to reach across the months since his death to grab her by the throat. My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and you've likely discovered the pipe system I helped install in 2001. I pray you'll never have to read these words, but I need you to know the truth about what I became involved in and why I spent the last months of my life trying to stop it. When we moved to Maple Grove Circle, I was approached by Richard Whitmore and several other neighbors about what they called a community improvement project. They said property values were at risk due to demographic changes in the surrounding area, and they needed someone with my engineering background to help design a discrete irrigation system for enhanced landscaping. I was naive, Sarah. Stupidly, criminally naive. I believed their story about aesthetic enhancement and community beautification. I designed and helped install what I thought was a sophisticated sprinkler system to keep our neighborhood's lawns and gardens pristine. It wasn't until 3 years later that I discovered what the system was really being used for. Sarah's vision blurred with tears as she continued reading. Outside, she could hear more vehicles arriving, probably the hazmat team and environmental, crime investigators the sergeant had called for. The night I found out, I was doing routine maintenance on our pool's connection to the system when I decided to test the water quality. Sarah, what I found will haunt me for whatever time I have left. The water flowing through those pipes wasn't fertilizer or irrigation supplements. It was a carefully calibrated mixture of chemicals designed to cause respiratory problems, skin, irritation, and neurological issues. Not enough to kill quickly, but enough to make life miserable for anyone exposed to it long term. The mixture was being distributed through lawn sprinklers, seeping into foundations, and being released near air intake systems of targeted homes. Karen Whitmore was the architect of it all. She had researched the chemical composition herself. Apparently, her undergraduate degree in chemistry wasn't just for show. The other neighbors provided funding and property access, but Karen was the mastermind. They had been systematically poisoning families who didn't fit their vision of the right kind of neighborhood. The Johnsons' respiratory problems, the Martinez, children's skin conditions, the Williams family's mysterious illnesses, all of it was chemical warfare disguised as bad luck. Sarah dropped the letter, bile rising in her throat. She ran to the kitchen sink and vomited, her body rejecting the horrific truth as violently as her mind wanted to. When the waves of nausea passed, she forced herself to continue reading. I confronted Karen immediately. I told her I was shutting down the entire system and going to the police. That's when she revealed how deep the conspiracy went, Sarah. This isn't just our neighborhood. There are similar systems in at least a dozen affluent communities across the state, all connected through a network of people in local government, real estate, and law enforcement. Karen showed me photographs of officials taking payments, recordings of planning meetings, documentation of cover-ups when families tried to report the suspicious illnesses. She had insurance on everyone involved, including me. You helped build this, David, she told me. You're as guilty as any of us. Try to expose us, and we'll make sure you go down as the criminal mastermind behind a conspiracy to commit mass poisoning. Your wife is a school teacher, David. How do you think it will? Look when we reveal that she was married to a domestic terrorist? Sarah's hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold the letter steady. David had been trapped, blackmailed into silence by his own unwitting participation. But the letter continued. So I started planning, Sarah. If I couldn't expose them safely while I was alive, I would create an insurance policy for after my death. I began documenting everything: financial records, chemical purchase orders, medical records of affected families, communications between the conspirators. I also started sabotaging the system. Remember those equipment failures I kept having to fix over the past year? Those weren't accidents. I was deliberately causing malfunctions to reduce the chemical distribution while making it look like normal maintenance issues. Every breakdown bought the targeted families a few more weeks or months of clean air and water. But Karen was getting suspicious. Last month, she confronted me about the increased system failures. I think she's figured out what I've been doing. Sarah, I'm scared, not for myself, but for you and Emma. If something happens to me, please know that whatever guilt you might feel about David Chen, the engineer who built that system, David Chen, the husband who loved you, spent every day since discovering the truth, trying to make it right. The letter was signed with David's name, followed by one more crucial paragraph. The key is for Safety Deposit Box 247 at First National Bank. The USB drive contains copies of everything, but the originals are in the box along with additional evidence I've gathered. Sarah, I'm not brave enough to be a whistleblower while I'm alive, but I pray that you are braver than I was. Make them pay for what they've done. Make them pay for all of it. All my love, David P.S. Trust no one in local law enforcement until you've reviewed the files. The corruption runs deeper than you can imagine. Sarah sat in stunned silence as the implications crashed over her like a tsunami. David hadn't been a willing participant in the poisoning. He'd been a victim of his own good intentions, manipulated and then trapped by people who'd turned his engineering skills into weapons of racial terrorism. And if the letter was right, David's heart attack hadn't been natural at all. A sharp knock at her back door made Sarah jump. Through the glass, she could see Detective Marcus Rivera, a middle-aged Latino man she vaguely recognized from David's funeral. He'd introduced himself as one of David's former students. David had taught part-time engineering courses at the community college before his death. Sarah quickly folded the letter and slipped it into her pocket along with the key and USB drive. Her mind raced as she opened the door. Could she trust him? David's warning about law enforcement echoed in her mind, but Detective Rivera had seemed genuinely grief-stricken at the funeral. "Mrs. Chen," Rivera said respectfully, removing his hat. "I'm sorry to bother you during this chaos, but I need to ask you some questions about what we've discovered outside." "Of course, Detective. Please, come in." Rivera stepped into the kitchen, his experienced eyes taking in Sarah's obvious distress. "Ma'am, I have to tell you, this situation is much more serious than a simple excavation issue. The preliminary chemical analysis from the pipe system is concerning." Sarah studied his face carefully. "How concerning?" "We're looking at potential charges of environmental terrorism, conspiracy to commit assault, and possibly, well, we're looking at the possibility that people may have died as a result of what was being pumped through that system." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "Died?" Rivera nodded grimly. "We've started cross-referencing unusual deaths and illnesses in this neighborhood with addresses that connect to the pipe system. There are some troubling patterns emerging." This was it, the moment of truth. Sarah made a decision that would either save her life or end it. "Detective Rivera," she said carefully, "before we go any further, I need to know something. Are you here because you suspect my husband was involved in this conspiracy, or because you suspect he was trying to stop it?" Rivera's expression sharpened. "That's an interesting question, Mrs. Chen. Why would you think he was trying to stop it?" Sarah pulled the letter from her pocket and placed it on the kitchen table. "Because he left me this." Rivera read the letter in tense silence, his face growing darker with each paragraph. When he finished, he looked up at Sarah with a mixture of admiration and fear. "Mrs. Chen, if this letter is accurate, your husband wasn't just trying to stop a neighborhood conspiracy. He was trying to expose a criminal network that could involve dozens of officials across multiple jurisdictions. Do you think they killed him for it?" Rivera was quiet for a long moment. Detective Rivera motioned for Sarah to stay back as he positioned himself beside the kitchen door, weapon drawn. The lock clicking continued with methodical precision. Whoever was picking it was a professional. "Mrs. Whitmore," Rivera called, out, his voice carrying the authority of 20 years in law enforcement. "This is Detective Rivera with Metro Police. You need to step away from that door immediately." Karen's laugh was light and musical, completely at odds with the menace of the situation. "Oh, Detective Rivera. Marcus, isn't it? I remember you from the community college fundraiser last spring. You gave such a lovely speech about David Chen's contributions to the engineering program." The lock clicked open. "I'm afraid I can't." "Step away just yet, Detective. You see, Sarah has something that belongs to our community, and we simply must have it back. I'm sure you understand the importance of neighborhood cooperation." Rivera's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, you're currently committing breaking and entering. If you have Emma Chen, that's kidnapping. I strongly advise you to—" The door swung open with deliberate slowness, and Karen Whitmore stepped into Sarah's kitchen as if she owned it. Gone was the yoga-attired suburban queen from that morning. This Karen wore a tailored black suit that screamed expensive lawyer or high-level executive, her platinum hair pulled back in a severe bun that made her sharp cheekbones look predatory. But it wasn't Karen that made Sarah's blood run cold. It was the two men who followed her inside. They moved with the fluid precision of military operators, their eyes constantly scanning for threats, hands resting casually near concealed weapons. These weren't suburban conspirators playing at espionage. These were professionals. "Detective Rivera," Karen said pleasantly, settling into the chair across from Sarah as if this were a planned social visit. "I'm going to save us all a great deal of trouble by being completely honest about the situation." One of the men positioned himself near the window with a clear view of the backyard where the excavation continued. The other remained by the door, effectively blocking any escape route. Your investigation into our neighborhood improvement project has created some complications for a number of very important people. People who prefer to remain anonymous. People who have invested considerable resources in maintaining the character and property values of select communities across the region. Rivera kept his weapon trained on Karen, but Sarah could see the calculation in his eyes. 2 armed professionals, unknown backup outside, and Emma's life hanging in the balance. The odds weren't good. "Where's my daughter?" Sarah demanded, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Karen smiled with genuine warmth, as if Sarah had asked about the weather. "Emma is enjoying the hospitality of some associates of ours at a secure location. Perfectly safe, I assure you. She's actually been quite helpful, telling us all about her father's work habits, his home office setup, where he might have hidden important documents. If you hurt her..." "Sarah, darling, I'm not a monster. Emma is a lovely girl, and as long as you cooperate, she'll be returned to her dormitory with nothing more than a fascinating story that she'll hopefully be wise enough never to tell anyone." Karen leaned forward, her blue eyes sharp as winter. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to give me David's insurance policy, the USB drive, the safety deposit box key, and anything else he left behind. In exchange, Emma comes home safely, and you get to continue your quiet life as a grieving widow. And if I refuse?" Karen's smile never wavered. "Then Emma disappears permanently. Detective Rivera suffers a tragic accident during what will be recorded as a failed arrest attempt, and well, you'll join your husband sooner than expected." Rivera spoke up, his voice steady despite the impossible situation. "Mrs. Whitmore, you're threatening to murder a police officer. That's..." "Detective," Karen interrupted smoothly, "let me enlighten you about exactly who you're dealing with. The network David stumbled upon isn't a group of racist neighbors playing with garden chemicals. We are a carefully coordinated consortium of real estate developers, city planners, law enforcement officials, and government contractors who have been systematically managing demographic transitions in targeted communities for over 30 years. She gestured to one of her companions who produced a tablet and began scrolling through files. "We have documentation of your mortgage payments, Detective. The loan that allowed you to buy your home in Riverside Heights. A loan that was approved, despite your debt-to-income ratio being well above normal lending standards. The bank that approved that loan received significant investment funding from companies controlled by our network." Rivera's face went pale, but his weapon remained steady. "We have records of your son Miguel's acceptance to West Point," Karen continued relentlessly, "including the letter of recommendation from Congressman Bradley, a letter written after Congressman Bradley received a very generous campaign contribution from one of our subsidiary organizations." Sarah watched in horror as Karen systematically dismantled Rivera's life, revealing the invisible web of influence and control that had shaped his family's opportunities. "Your ex-wife's medical treatment for breast cancer, the experimental therapy that saved her life, was provided at a research hospital funded by our pharmaceutical partners." "Should I continue, Detective?" Rivera's weapon hand was trembling now. "You're saying my family's entire life has been controlled by your network?" "Not controlled, Detective. Managed. We prefer to think of ourselves as community investment specialists. We identify promising individuals and families, and we help them achieve their potential within carefully planned demographic frameworks." Karen turned back to Sarah. "Your husband was supposed to be one of our success stories. A brilliant engineer who understood the importance of maintaining property values and community standards. Unfortunately, David developed a conscience at precisely the wrong time." Sarah clutched the USB drive in her pocket, her mind racing. "You killed him." "David killed himself, darling. He had been taking medication for anxiety and depression, medication that doesn't interact well with certain other substances. When he threatened to expose our work, we simply provided some additional stress in his life. The heart attack was an unfortunate but natural consequence." The casual way Karen discussed David's murder made Sarah's vision blur with rage. "You poisoned him." "We helped him understand the consequences of his choices. The attack happened during his morning jog, a route he took every day, past the community garden where our irrigation system provided supplemental nutrients to the landscaping. David chose to continue that route even after we made it clear that certain areas of the neighborhood had become unhealthy for people asking too many questions." Rivera spoke through gritted teeth. "You're confessing to murder." Karen laughed, the sound genuinely delighted. "Detective, I'm confessing to community management. Everything we've done has been perfectly legal within the jurisdictions we operate in. You see, we don't just manage demographics, we manage the legal framework that governs demographic management." She stood up and walked to Sarah's kitchen window, gazing out at the chaos in the backyard, where hazmat teams were now documenting the chemical distribution system. "Do you see all those official investigators out there, Sarah? Half of them are on our payroll. The other half will find that their evidence mysteriously disappears during processing, or that key witnesses become unavailable for testimony, or that jurisdictional complications make prosecution impossible." Sarah felt despair washing over her as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. It wasn't just a neighborhood scheme. It was a systematic corruption of every institution that might provide justice. "However," Karen continued, "we prefer to resolve situations amicably when possible. Which brings us back to our original offer. David's evidence in exchange for Emma's safety and your continued well-being." Sarah looked at Rivera, seeing her own desperation reflected in his eyes. They were outmatched, outgunned, and apparently surrounded by a network of corruption that had tentacles reaching into every level of government and law enforcement. But as she stared at Karen's confident smile, Sarah remembered something from David's letter, something that gave her a flicker of hope. "David was smarter than you gave him credit for," Sarah said quietly. Karen's smile faltered slightly. "I'm sorry?" Sarah pulled the USB drive from her pocket and held it up. "This isn't David's insurance policy. This is his bait." She saw confusion flash across Karen's face for the first time since the woman had entered her kitchen. "David knew you had people in law enforcement. He knew you had corrupted officials and controlled evidence processing. So he didn't just gather evidence, he distributed it." Sarah's voice grew stronger as she saw genuine alarm beginning to replace Karen's confidence. "The real evidence isn't in a safety deposit box in this city, Karen. David sent copies to journalists, federal investigators, congressional oversight committees, and international human rights organizations, all with instructions to open the packages if anything happened to him or his family." Karen's composure cracked completely. "That's impossible. We monitored his communications. We watched his mail." "He didn't send them himself," Sarah lied smoothly, praying her bluff would work. "He gave them to Emma during her last visit home. She..." The color drained from Karen's face so quickly that Sarah thought the woman might faint. Karen's hand went instinctively to her throat, her perfectly manicured fingers touching the skin there as if checking for symptoms. "What are you talking about?" Karen's voice was barely a whisper. Sarah felt a surge of grim satisfaction as the pieces of David's final gambit began falling into place. "David didn't just spend his last month sabotaging your system randomly, Karen. He was very specific about which connections he damaged and which ones he improved." Detective Rivera caught on immediately. "Mrs. Chen, are you saying—" "I'm saying that David was a very thorough engineer. When he discovered what you were really doing, Karen, he didn't just document it. He turned your own weapon against you." Karen stumbled backward until she hit the kitchen counter, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. "That's impossible. We tested the water quality regularly. Richard monitored everything personally." "Richard tested the public water supply," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength as she realized the full brilliance of David's revenge. But did he test your private well? The one that supplies your infinity pool and your irrigation system? The tablet slipped from Karen's associate's hands and clattered to the floor. Both men were now staring at their employer with dawning alarm. "Ma'am," the man by the window said urgently, "if what she's saying is true, it's not true!" Karen screamed, but her voice cracked with hysteria. "David Chen was a coward! He wouldn't have had the nerve to—" "To what?" Sarah interrupted. "To poison the woman who murdered her husband? Karen, you told me yourself that David spent 6 months planning before he died. Did you really think he was just gathering evidence?" Sarah pulled out her phone and began scrolling through David's old photos. "David documented everything, remember? Including his maintenance visits to your property." She found what she was looking for and turned the phone toward Karen. The photo showed David working on pipe connections behind Karen's pool house, but what made Karen's face go white was the timestamp, 3 days before David's death. "He knew you were going to kill him," Sarah said quietly. "So he made sure that when you did, you'd be killing yourself too, slowly, painfully, just like you did to all those innocent families." Karen's legs gave out and she slumped against the counter. "How long?" she whispered. "How long what? How long have I been? How long has the contamination been?" Sarah looked at the photo timestamp, then at the kitchen calendar. "About 11 months, Karen. Every day you've been swimming in your pool, every shower you've taken, every glass of water from your kitchen tap. David made sure you were getting a very special cocktail." Rivera was staring at Sarah with a mixture of admiration and horror. "Mrs. Chen, what exactly did your husband put in their water supply?" Sarah turned to Karen with cold satisfaction. "Why don't you tell us, Karen? You're the chemistry expert. What were the symptoms you designed for your victims? Respiratory problems? Neurological issues? Skin irritation?" Karen's hand went to her throat again, and Sarah noticed for the first time that there was a faint rash along Karen's neckline, barely visible under her makeup, but definitely there. "Those headaches you've been having," Sarah continued relentlessly, "the ones Richard mentioned to David last month, the fatigue, the way you've been losing weight despite eating normally, the memory problems. I bet you've been more forgetful lately, haven't you?" "Stop," Karen whispered. "And Richard, how's his health been? Still playing tennis 3 times a week? Or has he been having trouble with shortness of breath?" Karen's associate pulled out his phone. "Ma'am, I'm calling for immediate medical evacuation." "No!" Karen snapped, some of her composure returning. "You'll do no such thing. Even if what she's saying is true, we still have the upper hand. Those families are still being poisoned right now, and only we have the neutralizing agent." She straightened up, fighting through whatever symptoms she was experiencing. "Sarah, you can gloat about your husband's revenge later. Right now, innocent, people are dying, and you're the only one who can save them." "Actually," said a new voice from the kitchen doorway, "that's not entirely accurate." Everyone turned to see a woman in a FBI windbreaker standing in the entrance, flanked by 2 agents in full tactical gear. She was middle-aged, with graying hair and the kind of intense focus that came from years of hunting dangerous criminals. "Agent Patricia Vance, Environmental Crime Task Force," the woman announced. "And Mrs. Whitmore, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit environmental terrorism, multiple counts of attempted murder, and about 47 other federal charges that we'll discuss once we get you into custody." Karen laughed bitterly. "Agent Vance, you're too late. The chemical release began 15 minutes ago. Unless I personally authorize the deployment of our neutralizing agent, at least 60 people in this neighborhood are going to die within the hour." Agent Vance smiled coldly. "Oh, you mean this neutralizing agent?" She held up a small device that looked like an industrial remote control. "The one our hazmat teams found in the trunk of your associate's vehicle? The one they've already deployed across the affected area?" The 2 men who had entered with Karen immediately dropped their hands away from their weapons and raised them above their heads. Professional criminals they might be, but they weren't stupid enough to draw on federal agents. Karen stared at the device in Vance's hand, her face cycling through disbelief, rage, and finally, desperate calculation. That's impossible. You couldn't have found our neutralizing stores without this. Agent Vance held up a second item, a GPS tracker. Mrs. Whitmore, did you really think we'd been sitting around waiting for you to confess? We've been tracking your network for 6 months. Sarah felt her legs give out with relief. 6 months? Your husband was never working alone, Mrs. Chen, Agent Vance explained. David Chen contacted the FBI through back channels last year. He'd been feeding us information about the conspiracy while documenting evidence and sabotaging their operations. Rivera lowered his weapon, his face a mixture of relief and confusion. Ma'am, if the Bureau was already investigating, why wasn't local law enforcement informed? Agent Vance's expression darkened. Because David Chen provided us with evidence that the corruption extended into local police departments, city government, and state regulatory agencies. We couldn't risk compromising the investigation. She turned back to Karen. Mrs. Whitmore, David Chen didn't just turn your water supply against you. He turned your entire network against itself. Every communication you thought was secure, every financial transaction you believed was hidden, every official you thought was bought and paid for, David helped us monitor it all. Karen's face went through a series of expressions before settling on something resembling impressed rage. David Chen played us. David Chen was a hero, Agent Vance corrected. He risked his life to expose a criminal conspiracy that spans 12 states and involves over 200 individuals in positions of public trust. Sarah's phone buzzed with an incoming call. Emma's number. Mom? Emma's voice was shaky but alive. Mom, these FBI agents just rescued me from some warehouse. They said Dad was working with them. I don't understand what's happening. Sarah closed, her eyes, tears of relief streaming down her face. It's over, sweetheart. It's finally over. But Agent Vance held up a warning hand. Not quite over, Mrs. Chen. We still need your testimony, and there are still members of this network who don't. No, we've been watching them. Karen, now handcuffed and flanked by agents, managed one last venomous smile. You think this is over? Sarah, darling, you have no idea how deep this goes. David may have exposed our local operations, but we're just one small branch of something, much larger. Agent Vance silenced Karen with a look before turning back to Sarah. Mrs. Whitmore is right about one thing. This investigation is far from over. But the immediate threat to your neighborhood has been neutralized, the chemical weapons have been secured, and the people responsible for your husband's death are going to prison for the rest of their lives. As the agents led Karen and her associates away, Sarah sank into David's chair and finally allowed herself to process what had just happened. David hadn't been a victim of blackmail who died trying to expose corruption. He'd been an undercover informant who'd spent the last year of his life systematically dismantling a criminal network from the inside. Detective Rivera sat down across from her, shaking his head in amazement. Mrs. Chen, your husband was either the bravest man I've ever heard of or the most devious. Both, Sarah said softly. He was definitely both. Through the kitchen window, she could see the FBI hazmat teams working to neutralize the chemical distribution system that had terrorized her neighborhood for over 2 decades. News crews were being held back at the street level, but she could see reporters already setting up for what would undoubtedly become a national story. Agent Vance returned to the kitchen, pulling up a chair next to Sarah. Mrs. Chen, I know this has been an overwhelming day, but I need to prepare you for what comes next. More trials, more testimony. More than that, I'm afraid. Mrs. Whitmore was telling the truth about one thing. 3 weeks later, Sarah Chen sat in a nondescript federal building in downtown Chicago, watching Agent Vance spread photographs across a conference table like playing cards in a deadly game. The images showed houses, office buildings, and municipal facilities in cities across the country, all connected by an invisible web of corruption that made Karen Whitmore's neighborhood conspiracy look like a children's game. "Phoenix, Arizona," Agent Vance said, pointing to the first set of photos. 17 families forced out of a gentrifying district due to mysterious water quality issues. All minority families, all replaced by tech executives within 6 months. She moved to the next set. Portland, Oregon. Native American families experiencing respiratory problems traced to agricultural runoff that somehow only affected houses on the reservation border. Sarah's stomach churned as the scope became clear. "How many cities?" 47 that we've confirmed so far. "But Mrs. Chen, that's not why I asked you here today." Agent Vance's expression was grim. "We've intercepted communications indicating that the network is planning something much larger than targeted neighborhood poisoning." Detective Rivera, who had become Sarah's unofficial liaison with law enforcement, leaned forward in his chair. "Larger how?" Agent Vance pulled out a laptop and turned it toward them. The screen showed a map of the United States with dozens of red dots scattered across major metropolitan areas. They call it Operation Clean Slate. The idea is to trigger a coordinated series of environmental accidents in predominantly minority communities across 12 major cities. Chemical plant explosions, water treatment failures, toxic spills, all designed to look accidental while forcing mass relocations. Sarah felt the room spinning around her. Mass relocations of how many people? Conservative estimate, 2 million Americans. All communities that happen to sit on land targeted for high-end development projects. Rivera whistled low. "That's not terrorism. That's ethnic cleansing." "It's both," Agent Vance confirmed. "And according to our intelligence, the operation launches in 72 hours. Sarah stared at the map, trying to process the monstrous scope of what they were describing. "How is this possible? How could a network this large operate without being detected?" Agent Vance clicked to the next screen, which showed an organizational chart that looked like a family tree of American power structures. "Because they're not operating outside the system, Mrs. Chen. They are the system." The chart showed connections between real estate conglomerates, pharmaceutical companies, defense contractors, and government agencies at every level. Names Sarah recognized from news headlines were linked to shell companies, which were linked to development projects, which were linked to the same environmental consulting firms that had designed Karen's poison distribution system. "The network your husband exposed was just one operational cell," Agent Vance explained. "The real organization is called the Heritage Foundation, not to be confused with the legitimate think tank of the same name. This Heritage Foundation has been working for 40 years to systematically reshape American demographics through what they call guided population management." Rivera was studying the chart with the focused intensity of someone connecting dots. "Agent Vance, some of these companies, I've seen them involved in police equipment contracts, prison construction, private security." "Exactly. They profit from the problems they create. Displace minority communities, build private prisons, to house the inevitable social unrest, sell surveillance equipment to monitor the displaced populations, then develop the cleared land for luxury housing." Sarah felt a cold anger building in her chest. "And our government just lets this happen?" "Mrs. Chen, significant portions of our government are either complicit or compromised. The Heritage Foundation has been placing their people in key positions for decades. EPA administrators, HUD officials, federal judges, congressional staffers, they've built a shadow government within the actual government." Agent Vance clicked to another screen showing financial records. "But here's what your husband discovered that made him so dangerous to them. The Heritage Foundation isn't just an American operation. They're part of an international network of similar organizations operating in at least 12 countries." "International?" The same techniques they've been testing on American communities are being used to displace indigenous populations in Australia, minority communities in Europe, and ethnic groups in Africa and Asia. They share resources, technology, and personnel across national boundaries. Sarah thought about the text message she'd received after Karen's arrest, the thread about roots and growing back. So even if we stop the American operation, the international network continues, and they rebuild. They're American operations with new people and new methods, Agent Vance confirmed. Which is why I asked you here today. We need your help to stop Operation Clean Slate, but more importantly, we need your help to expose the entire international network. Rivera frowned. Agent Vance, with all due respect, Mrs. Chen is a high school teacher, not an international spy. How could she possibly? Because, Agent Vance interrupted, David Chen wasn't just gathering evidence on the local conspiracy. He was building a comprehensive database of the entire Heritage Foundation network, financial records, personnel files, operational plans, communication protocols, everything. She turned to Sarah. Mrs. Chen, the USB drive you found in your husband's effects, that was just the local operational data. The real treasure trove is hidden somewhere else, and David left clues for you to find it. Sarah's mind raced back to David's letter, trying to remember every detail. He mentioned additional evidence in the safety deposit box, but we already retrieved that. We retrieved what was in the safety deposit box registered under David's name, Agent Vance corrected. But according to financial records we've uncovered, David rented at least 3 other boxes under false identities. He scattered the evidence across multiple locations as insurance against exactly this kind of coordinated retaliation. Agent Vance pulled out a manila envelope and slid it across the table. These are copies of documents we found in Karen Whitmore's home office during our raid. They include references to a Chen protocol and something called the Professor's Archive. Sarah opened the envelope and found herself looking at pages of handwritten notes in Karen's careful script. The writing was full of paranoid observations about David's activities in his final months, but one section made Sarah's blood run cold. Richard believes Chen has been using university resources to store data. The community college network provides access to off-site servers that would be invisible to our monitoring systems. If Chen has been building an archive, it would likely be accessible through his teaching portal using some kind of academic authentication system. David's teaching password, Sarah whispered. Mrs. Chen? David taught part-time at Metropolitan Community College. He was obsessive about password security. He used to joke that he had a different password for every system he accessed. Sarah's pulse quickened as the memory crystallized. But he always used the same format, a mathematical sequence based on Emma's birthday combined with chemistry element symbols. Agent Vance leaned forward. Could you reconstruct his passwords? Maybe. But Agent Vance, if this archive exists and it's as comprehensive as you think, won't accessing it put me in immediate danger from the Heritage Foundation? Mrs. Chen, you're already in immediate danger. The threatening message you received was just the beginning. Our intelligence indicates that the Heritage Foundation has authorized what they call permanent solutions for you, Emma, and anyone else connected to David's investigation. Rivera's face went dark. Permanent solutions? Assassinations, Agent Vance said bluntly. They've already tried twice. The car accident you avoided last week when that truck ran the red light, the food poisoning that sent you to the hospital, those weren't random incidents. Sarah felt her world tilting again as she realized how close she'd come to dying without even knowing she was under attack. They've been trying to kill me for weeks? They've been trying to kill you since the day you discovered that pipe system. The only reason you're still alive is because we've had you under protective surveillance, and because they're hoping you'll lead them to David's archive before they eliminate you. The conference room fell silent as the implications sank in. Sarah was trapped between a shadowy international conspiracy that wanted her dead and a government investigation that needed her to risk her life to stop a massive terrorist attack. What exactly are you asking me to do? Agent Vance stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. We're asking you to access your husband's archive and help us map the complete Heritage Foundation network. But Mrs. Chen, I need to be completely honest about what that means. She turned back to face Sarah, her expression grave. If you help us, you'll become the most wanted target of one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the world. They will hunt you for the rest of your life. Emma will never be safe. You'll spend years in witness protection, assuming we can keep you alive that long. And if I don't help you, Operation Clean